We will now have two panels, one after the other, where scholars will introduce their research shortly with a short presentation and then a further discussion with designated discussants after each panel. And to begin is Anne-Sophie Grimaud, who holds a PhD in visual culture. She's a postdoctoral researcher and visiting scholar at the Edda Center of Excellence. She's affiliated with the University of Copenhagen and a part of the joint research project Denmark and the New North Atlantic. Her publications are mainly on crypto-colonial aspects on Icelandic culture and the role of art in the negotiation of national identity. And the title of her talk is To Be or Not to Be Post-Colonial, Iceland as Center and Periphery. Please. It should be somewhere there on the...
Here, I guess.
There we go.
Hope it will behave.
And...
So about here.
yeah.
All right. It's good to be here with you guys. We've been looking forward to combining these different aspects that are reflected in the keynote speeches. I've been inspired by Michael Herzfeld's work in my own research of Icelandic nation building and international relations since I commenced my doctoral research that was published in the thesis with an English translation, Crypto-Colonial Landscapes, last year. Today I'll briefly sweep over some points from my recent work. Denmark has been not always explicit, but nonetheless significant other informations of Icelandic national identity. In the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries, in Iceland have been characterized by nationalist currents, resulting in the complex disruption in the relationship between Denmark and Iceland. The rising nationalism and independence movement in Iceland caused a redefinition of how to draw the lines between the inside and the outside of the perceived collectives of Denmark and Iceland. Whereas the nature and importance of the relationship between Denmark and Iceland was high on the agenda in both countries before the separation, the discussion has since largely fallen silent. The silencing of this issue has become so complete that one can still meet Danes who are not sure about the current nature of the political bonds between the countries, and some are even unsure as to whether Iceland is still in fact a Danish dependency. Thus, the obscurity has developed to such an extent that it caught my attention as well as that of other scholars. There's no doubt that the ties to Denmark and other significant power factors have shaped Icelandic society and culture, as has also the limited focus on the aspect of this history. Slavoj Žižek has criticized post-colonial studies for reducing economical inequalities and structures to pseudo-psychological questions of otherness and projections. But the theory of crypto-colonial relations, as presented in Michael Herzfeld's writings, can undoubtedly contain both these aspects. Due to economical and imperial structures, as well as myths connected to the region, Iceland has for long been perceived as being situated in the geographical periphery of the far north, an area that can be said to have functioned as a buffer zone in a European perspective towards the cultural and ethnic other, the Inuit. The connotations attached to this geographical position have varied, both in internal and external depictions, depending on shifting economical and ideological trends and shifting power centers. Icelandic historian and a colleague here at the university and present here today, Sumaliði Ísleifsson, has identified a number of dominant stereotypical ideas about the North. Notions that are still prevalent in images of Iceland in our century are, for example, the utopian North, a life in balance with nature, the original North, where customs lost in Europe still thrive, and the wealthy North, a place of natural and cultural abundance. As Herzfeld has pointed out, one feature that all these crypto-colonial societies share is an aggressive promotion of their claims to civilizational superiority or antiquity, claims that almost always appear disproportionate to their political influence. This feature is quickly recognized when examining Icelandic cultural history. During the independence movement, focus was on being recognizable as a nation equal to the world's dominant sovereign states. This diagram from the World Fair of 1905 clearly illustrates the ideological context of the time, marking the Eurocentric and imperialist hierarchy in which the Icelandic nation was forming. The crypto-colonial perspective also sheds light on current dynamics of Iceland being viewed as spiritual cultural source on one hand and economical and political outsider on the other. A perspective that could also be ground for a comparison between Greece and Iceland. The crypto-colonial optics aids us to investigate the consequences of the strong interest in Iceland's distant past and consequences of the utopian, dystopian, and heterotopian connotations of its geographical position on the modern identity formation. When looking at significations of temporal and spatial dimensions in all areas of visual culture, one can see projected ideas and aspirations connected to collective identity. The crypto-colonial perspective makes us sensitive to statements about time and space and how new boundaries have continuously been drawn and redrawn between the inside and outside of collectives, and how new self-images are created through renegotiations of external fantasies and by functionalization of memory. Iceland has been a unique country seen from Northern Europe, as it's been viewed as a haven or shrine for cultural heritage, and even as a living past. The strong associations with the past as an aspect of the original North has been reappropriated in commercial visual culture. After centuries of objection to primitivism and exotification associated with being of the past, there are recent examples of Icelandic branding that embraces the position as, quote, those who apparently have not fully crossed the threshold to modernity, unquote, as Kirsten has once put it. Apart from being a clever commercial strategy, Nororientalist self-exotification has been used as an identification strategy, also to cope with internal ruptures that are the consequences of modernity. Iceland as a place of otherness and an international heterotopia, that is a place of that is different, is a brand that has proven very sellable in the experience economy. The Frankfurt Book Fair in 2011, where Iceland was a guest of honor, was an example of a scene that was used for rebranding Iceland after the crisis, where old ideas about the original and utopian North were once again relaunched. After the years after the collapse in 2008 have also been used as a motor for reinvestigations of the deeper structures of Icelandic society, including some long-term implications of the Danish past, of the past as a Danish dependency. The position as an in-between, an either-or, on the modern political scene has meant that Iceland has had to cope with real consequences of international power relations and imperialism, as well as the exposed position between the superpowers of the Cold War. This has led to what Herzfeld has described as the unfavorable development patterns of many crypto-colonies. As he says, this has enabled local elites to maintain their grip on powers in a way that elsewhere has proven vulnerable. In an article from 2009, the Icelandic journalist Iris Erlingsdóttir directed a very sharp critique against the country's rulers with a rare post-colonial angle. She said, "The passivity learned from the colonizers has prevented any meaningful action by the people." And she continues, as Nobel Prize author Halldór Kiljan Laxness observed, Iceland's colonial overlords' nationalities simply changed from Danish to Icelandic. Erlingsdóttir then quotes the American politician Rahm Emanuel's dictum, "You should never waste a crisis." And the collapse and the following crisis certainly holds potential as an entrance to investigations of the views on the past and the deeper layers in identity construction. The old notion of the original North and the utopian North are reintroduced in ideas about Iceland in many current branding strategies, in political and corporate messages, expressing ideas about the future relationship between nature and society in Iceland and the region. The images promoted in the past of being a cultural cradle of Northern Europe has had a long-time side effect of hiding or obscuring the actual nature of social structure and the state of Icelandic democracy. Strategies after the crisis to find a place as something else than a pariah state has led to a promotion of the country as a place of uniqueness, a heterotopia, and even sometimes a utopia. Another strategy is positioning the country within the Arctic region in the making. Here, the official iconography and rhetorics place Iceland in the Arctic region as a north par excellence, or a super north, a leading power of the region. In a historical perspective, the divide between the perceived Germanic north and the Inuit has influenced the region's relations between Iceland and Arctic neighbors such as Greenland. As historian Guðmundur Hálfdanarson has shown, the discussions in 1911 of founding a university in Iceland was preoccupied with using such an institution to consolidate Iceland's status as a civilized society equal to other nations, and notably as a means to eventually leave the Society of Atlantic Islands that was referred to in the time as the Society of Barbarians in the parliamentary debate. The current governmental policy that rhetorically places Iceland as a leader, leiðandi afl, can be interpreted as a re-identification with the region and yet another step in the direction laid out in the Age of Nation Building. Official policy concerning energy and resources is reflected in the statement sent out by the public energy provider Orkuveita. Orkuveita's official brand is based on rhetorical and iconographical associations with purity. In the material, the company as well as the nation is linked with purity. The promotional material shows icy landscapes and waterfalls, followed by the diagram where pure energy is linked with Iceland as opposed to foreign energy. Finally, it's emphasized that Iceland is famous globally for providing pure energy. Being associated with the periphery in the Danish realm governed by, from Copenhagen and in relation to other European power centers, as well as with the center as a cradle for Germanic culture, has created some interesting crypto-colonial dynamics in Icelandic society for centuries. The current suggestions of a new center or Arctic Mediterranean, as suggested by Valur Ingimundarson, thus pushes what is considered the periphery further north. These trends in geographical narratives have opened up a field where new associations with the Arctic and Iceland are forming reciprocally. In an economy that rewards images association with the pristine through the cash flow of tourism and export on the basis of brand value, and at the same time rewards activities that alter increasingly large areas of wild nature, Iceland is benefiting from its unique image. The ideas of pure nature associated with Iceland's image are supported by the powerful and widespread stereotypes of the North. The centuries-long tradition of depicting Iceland as a special or even heterotopical place in Western civilization and as a pristine wilderness has the potential to focus as a smokescreen, hiding exploitionist practice from a green perspective. This potential is dangerous, not least in policies concerning the future of the Arctic region, and the voices of artists and other critics still only make out a very timid island in the ocean that is the consumer, fishery, and tourism-based industry. I'll conclude here with a slide that shows you elements from artworks, recent ones, by Hlynur Hallsson and Ósk Williamsdóttir, two artists who are critical towards the clean discourse of Icelandic energy production and the Icelandic image as a haven for pristine landscape or a utopian and wealthy North. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Sophie. You can either take a seat here, or if you want to watch the PowerPoints from the floor. We will be holding all questions until the end of the panel, and for those of you who are starting to long for coffee, we will have a coffee break after this panel. But moving on to the next speaker, Ólafur Rastrick is a cultural historian, adjunct lecturer in ethnology, and a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of History in the University of Iceland. He has published on Icelandic nationalism, cultural policy, and the politics of the national body. His talk is entitled Imagining Greenland as an Icelandic Colony, 1924 to 1955. And here he is.
Thank you, Kirsten. Good afternoon. As has already been highlighted so clearly by the previous speakers, current claims to the North are made in the context of historical circumstances. Some of the historical processes and perspectives are well known and apparent when dealing with present-day issues. Others are less so. Issues that have been pushed off the historiographical radar, dismissed as obscure and unimportant, of no relevance to our present concerns. What I'm going to do is to remind you of one such case, which at least Icelandic historians to date have had very little to say about, often dismissing it as an ill-conceived concern of a single eccentric scholar. Perhaps this case of Icelandic imperialist dreaming has received little attention in the recent years because it does not sit well with the present self-image of the Icelandic state as a supporter of self-determination of underprivileged nations. Iceland prides itself, for instance, for being the first to recognize the independence of the Baltic states in the 1990s. So if thinking of Denmark as a superpower is perceived ironically, thinking of Iceland as a colonial power is simply ludicrous. The story goes roughly like this. In the 1920s, following Iceland's ascent to sovereign nationhood in 1918, the question of whether and why Greenland should become an Icelandic colony was hotly debated by intellectuals and politicians in Iceland. The subject became addressed in the parliament, and a significant amount of articles and essays, books, doctoral theses appeared locally on the Greenland issue. The reason why this emerged in the 1920s is related to the debates between Norway and Denmark about eastern Greenland, Norwegians having had ties there, and the Danes seeking to limit foreign fisheries around Greenland. Despite the ruling of the World Court on the legal status of eastern Greenland in 1933, assigning sovereign power in Greenland to the Danish state exclusively, Icelanders continued to rehearse claims to Iceland well into the 1950s, interest only fading after the constitutional status of Greenland being altered in 1953, with Greenland being defined as an integral part of Denmark. So what I found curious about the Grænlandsmálið, as it was known locally, the Greenland issue, is how so many intellectuals, politicians, etc. could dream up this scheme of making Greenland an Icelandic colony only a few years after the country had assented to the status of independency. Especially as at this time the thrust of Icelandic historical narratives was all about the perils of foreign colonization. Iceland had, according to the dominating historical discourse at the time, after years and years of struggle, finally succeeded in freeing itself from the paralyzing chains of Danish domination. And yet, this idea of colonizing Greenland seemed to gain quite widespread attention. So what prompted such claims being made on behalf of this tiny nation, which seemed from the local perspective to be all too familiar with the perils and liabilities of foreign rule? Why did people in Iceland, having just emerged from colonial status of sorts to a post-colonial or crypto-colonial situation, start imagining Greenland as an Icelandic colony? Let's look briefly at the main arguments. They were historical and they were legal. People from Iceland had settled in Greenland in the Middle Ages. They were not Norwegians, but they were Icelanders. Greenland was part of the Icelandic legal system, our laws from the 10th century. And the same kind of legalistic claims were used, that were used in the 19th century to make claims for Iceland's independence from the emerging Danish nation-state, were used with reference to Gamli Sáttmáli, the agreement between Icelanders and the Norwegian king in 1262, and so on. So Iceland had a historical and legal right to Greenland. The cultural aspect, which had been very important for the independence movement in Iceland, was however not seen to be applicable here, for obvious reasons. The existence of a local population in Greenland did thus not amount to much in the discourse of the spokesmen for the Icelandic colonization of Greenland. People like Benediktsson and the most prominent advocate of the matter, Jón Duason, only fleetingly referred to the indigenous population, generally referring to them as skrælingjar, the same term as was used in the Nordic medieval literature. Mostly they seem to regard Greenland as terra nullus, not belonging to anyone before the settlers from Iceland arrived. When referring to Greenlanders at all, it was often, or more often than not, in the terms of the need for modernization, to save them from the not humane but the inhumane treatment of the Danes, that the Icelanders were supposedly better fitted to instruct or lead the Greenlanders, being more familiar with and have more understanding of, for instance, farming in such harsh climate conditions that could be found similarly in Iceland and Greenland. Now, I must say that this perspective did not go unchallenged. The Copenhagen-based historian Bogi Melsted expressed the view already in 1924 that the Greenland issue was the most disgusting matter on the political agenda, and stressed that Icelanders, if anyone, should appreciate that it was only the Greenlandic nation that could be considered the rightful owners of Greenland. So what... I've nearly finished, actually. So what prompted the interest of the Icelandic Parliament? In some form or other, the Greenland issue was taken up by the Alþingi most years well into the 1950s. Economic prospects most certainly, but I'm not going to say anything about that here. But there was also something else. In 1925, the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on the Greenland issue stated, when advocating the necessity of the matter, "I believe it is healthy and useful for the nation to have great and virtuous matters to work on, matters that can join together her strengths and enhance her awareness for independence. Enough persists that scatters and creates discord." So the resolution of the question of national independence in 1918 left a sort of a vacuum in Icelandic politics. There was no longer a political agenda that could unite the local community, none which seemed to generate the same unisonant feeling as the quest for national independence. Politics were turning into class politics. The idea of Icelanders as a united family was being put to the test. And in that respect, claiming Greenland seemed to be like a logical next step, a logical continuation of the struggle for Icelandic independence. And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Our next speaker is Ian Watson. He is Assistant Professor of Social Sciences at Bifröst, has a PhD from Rutgers and a BA from Harvard in Scandinavian Linguistics. He is a board member also of the Consumers Association of Iceland, and his talk is titled Post-Colonial Echoes in the Icelandic Consumer Experience. Gjörðu svo vel.
Thank you very much for the chance to come and speak to you today. How many of you live in Iceland and how many of you are coming here from abroad? First, how many of you are from Iceland? Okay, and how many of you are coming here from abroad? Okay, only a few, but enough so that I have to explain some things about how the Icelandic consumer experience works to you. The local retailer in Iceland plays a very large role, and this is a local retailer, kind of like a Home Depot in America or a Bauhaus in Germany. And they play such a big role because a lot of the time you really have no choice but to shop with them, even when their prices are very, very, very high. And my question today is to what extent we can consider this a post-colonial state of affairs, a state of affairs that has roots in Iceland's colonial history. And I want to switch first to America for a moment. So imagine that you live in the state of Rhode Island, which doesn't have all that many more people than Iceland, and you want to buy a computer. So here are some of your choices. You can buy a computer at a local retailer. You can order a computer directly from the manufacturer and have it shipped directly to you. You can order it from an online retailer and have it shipped directly to you. You can also order it from an online seller and pick it up at one of their local stores. And another option is that you can go get it directly from a manufacturer which has a local outlet store. Now, if you're buying a laptop in Iceland, you pretty much have to choose from the computers that are on sale at the local stores. There's some other options. I'll talk about them in a minute. Some of these local stores sell only certain brands, and they might even be the exclusive sales agent in Iceland for those brands. There is an Apple store in Iceland. Now, one of your other options is to leave the country. So you can go abroad and you can buy a computer there. And many Icelanders do this. And the power of reification, coming to believe that something is inevitable, is such that many people think that this is normal to shop this way in Iceland. But of course, the reality in Iceland, and even more so now than in 2007, is that not everybody can afford to fly abroad to shop. Still, though, it's been claimed that H&M is Iceland's best-selling clothing retailer, even though H&M doesn't have any stores in Iceland. So these were bought in Erfurt in Germany at H&M. And I bought some clothes in Naples, too, at H&M. I'm lucky to have a job that forces me to go overseas, even when I don't want to, during the summers. But again, not everybody can do that. And of course, if you do go abroad, when you come back, you may have to pay some extra money. You might have to pay value-added tax on your purchases if your clothes or if your computer cost altogether more than 88,000 crowns. That's the current limit. Of course, some people have been known to say, if you wear it, don't declare it. But you can be stopped and you can have to pay fines in addition to the value-added tax if you don't declare what you have. And basically, going abroad is an option that's primarily available to those who have extra income or those whose jobs pay for their travel. So a third option is that in theory, you can also order a computer to be shipped to Iceland from abroad. Relatively few people do this. The shipping costs are expensive. You have to pay value-added tax on the purchase when it arrives, as well as a processing fee. And all of this delays the arrival of your package. So even ordering a spare part for your computer can become quite complicated and expensive. Now, to understand this a little bit better, imagine that you lived in Rhode Island, but you ordered a computer from Boston, or you went to Boston to pick it up. And when that computer crossed the Rhode Island line, you can see the road over there on the side of the picture. You might be driving it back yourself, or it might be coming in a truck owned by the post office. You would have to pay all kinds of extra taxes and processing fees when it crossed the Rhode Island line. So, all in Iceland, local retailers have a huge amount of power in deciding what goods are made available to the Icelandic consumer and at what price, and much more so than in other developed countries in 2013. And it's very hard for Icelanders to do business directly with the manufacturers and retailers of their choice who work outside the bounds of the local community. And that's perhaps the key generalization here, is that it's hard for Icelanders to do business with retailers who are outside the bounds of the local community. So you see these teeny little glass fuses that are on sale at Beko. You could order them actually for a fraction of the price from Germany, but the administrative costs of getting them here make it more or less unworkable. Now, we all know, I think, that this has historical roots. And we all know that from 1602 to 1855, making things a little bit simpler than they really are, only Danish merchants were permitted to trade with Iceland. They built warehouses that are like this one that are still standing in Hofsós. And these rules were relaxed in the 1780s. They were more or less abolished after 1855. But we all know that some of the big wholesale import businesses in Iceland are still run by families with Danish roots. This is just one of many examples. And monopolies and oligopolies developed. Over time, new businesses and grassroots movements like the various sort of ordering societies arose to challenge these monopolies. Here's one of the businesses that was sort of an upstart challenger. And of course, we all know that some of these businesses or groups grew into monopolies of their own. And then, of course, by the mid-20th century, the trade monopoly was gone, long gone, but there were currency restrictions. This is a newspaper article about increased currency restrictions in the 1930s. There was very tight control of import licenses. Foreign travel was still out of easy reach. Icelanders couldn't order from the Sears or the Neckermann or the Blackwell's catalogs. They couldn't take part in larger consumer arenas. I don't want to, by the way, overstate Denmark's current role in the Icelandic retail sector. These days, and increasingly so over the years, Iceland's peculiarities are self-imposed. So in 2013, in the age of the internet, of Amazon, of AliExpress or Deal Extreme, where you can order directly from Hong Kong, the prominence of local retailers in Icelandic commercial life doesn't make so much sense anymore. And my main job is social science teaching and editing up at Bifröst, but for 8 years I've been working hard to try to make it possible for Icelanders to shop more efficiently and pay lower prices. And this work has mostly been under the aegis of the Icelandic Consumers Association. So one of the things I did is I drafted this parliamentary resolution, which was then passed unanimously, actually, with members of all parties saying yes, which set up a committee to recommend changes to laws and regulations about direct ordering from abroad. And I'm actually part of the committee, and hopefully it's going to finish its work soon. It was supposed to finish on the 1st of September, but it hasn't quite yet. And in the process, I've also written this long, rather dry scholarly article about the history of taxation of cross-border purchases in Iceland. And in this article, I have a short section which goes over the history of Icelanders' freedom to choose the location of the sellers they purchase from. And so my question for you and for the panel today, I see some familiar faces up there, and I'm very interested in what you might have to say, is how to write this section. To what extent does it make sense to present the current situation as a last gasp of colonialism in Iceland, or the colonial system, or even going back out to the trade monopoly? Or should I use different words and concepts to frame the story? Should I talk about remoteness? Should I talk about the power of interest groups in shaping commercial laws currently? Should I talk about inertia? Should I talk about bi-Icelandic patriotism? And one thing that makes me think that the colonial perspective is at least interesting is that I've just begun to see in my own research that the Icelandic situation has parallels in other northern countries and surely in other colonial outposts. For example, I found pretty quickly when I started to look into this that there were a lot of allegations that the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada used its retail monopoly in a lot of the northern zones of the country to overcharge locals for consumer goods. And I think that there must also be parallels in Greenland and northern Scandinavia and Russia. And if anybody can help me find out about them, I would be very grateful. Retail is obviously a big business. The people who control retail trade can grow very rich off of it. Now, I can talk in great detail about the different tax treatment of express shipments and regular postal shipments, but I am not at all an insider when it comes to concepts like post-colonial and crypto-colonial. I really don't know how to use them, to be completely honest. So again, my question to you all is this. To what extent do you think there is value in seeing the continued prominence of retailers in Iceland as a colonial survival? Are Iceland's high retail prices, are Iceland's limited selection, are they post-colonial in some respect? Is control of retail trade a hallmark of colonial power? Are the enduring business relationships between Icelandic and foreign middlemen, are they examples of crypto-colonialism or maybe post-colonialism? So I'd like to humbly ask the panelists to help me understand these ideas and concepts better and to apply them to the Icelandic retail world. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. I must admit I bought this at H&M on a work trip, but none of these retailers are sponsoring the conference, I must also state that. But our next speaker is Ebbe Volkvarsen. He is a Magisterium Artium in Scandinavian Studies, European Ethnology and Political Science, and is currently a PhD student at the University of Gießen. Ebbe has written and edited a number of publications on post-colonial North Atlantic, Greenlandic culture, and Danish exceptionalism. So, Ebbe, please. Please correct me on my pronunciations as well.
Gießen is a city, but the rest was brilliant. Thank you. So, how do we start this? Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. What I want to do today is give you a brief insight in my work in progress, a research project dealing partly with Greenland, but also with another former Danish colony, Danish West Indies, nowadays US Virgin Islands, and that's why I have to apologize that I am confronting you with some pictures of palm trees as well in this very Arctic context. Møder sætter spor. Encounters leave their marks. This was the title of an exhibition shown at the Greenland National Museum in Nuuk some years ago. Although the exhibition had several thousand years of Greenlandic cultural history as its topic, the title raised no doubt about that the colonial encounter has been significant for the development of identity that Greenland has undergone and continues to experience in its current context with Denmark. Even these days, when Greenland, because of global warming and the prospect of a profitable exploitation of raw materials, is coming into the international spotlight, and while we are witnessing young, self-confident nations coming of age, the negotiation of Greenlandic self-conception and national identity is still based on the country's relation to the former colonial power. For the young generation in Greenland, it appears that this particular societal grounding in both the indigenous and the Danish is a natural starting point for a renegotiation of the national. However, this renegotiation is not thinkable without references to Denmark and Danish Greenlandic history. The encounter has left its mark. While there hardly can be any doubt about that Denmark has had a crucial impact on Greenlandic national identity, it seems to be far less clear to what extent the colonial encounter has affected Denmark's national self-image. This is basically what my research project is about. My questions are, has the colonial encounter affected Denmark's own conception of Danishness? Has it shaken the country's position within the imagined geographical entity of Scandinavia? And has the colonial past contributed to what you might call Nordic exceptionalism? Both Greenland and Denmark are facing a political momentum in which a revision of their national self-conceptions becomes necessary, whereas the implementation of self-government and the hope for independence through mining revenues for the case of Greenland is leading to a strengthening of national self-awareness. Denmark seems to be in an opposite situation. The discussions on Danishness, unique Danish values, and immigration have dominated the public debate, particularly in the last decade. This can be seen as an expression of that national identities are susceptible to the crises that arise as consequences of the blurring of real and mental borders, territorial benchmarks, and cultural differences in the globalized world. In order to understand why the debate on contemporary cultural encounters, immigration issues, and so forth, as threats to the nation state is so significant in Denmark, it is, I believe, beneficial to examine the national self-images that are created on the basis of the historical colonial encounter. Instead of researching how the colonial era came to mark the former colony's identity, I ask in how far a similar effect has also occurred in connection with the former colonial power's self-image. turning one of the central post-colonial dilemmas upside down, I believe, can contribute to a necessary reinterpretation of the Danish-Greenlandic relations in a time when Greenland is beginning to establish itself as an independent player on globalization's world map. I'm working with concepts such as imagined geographies and communities. Central to this approach is the perception of Nordic exceptionalism as an identity-creating spatial category that partly is constituted through collective memory processes and partly through the interaction of the Scandinavians' own self-images and others' views on Scandinavia. The imagined exceptionalism has caused the Scandinavian countries to appear as parts of a pan-Nordic space that manifests itself through discursively mediated images of a region characterized by its ethical and moral superiority, both in relation to the non-Western world and to the other European states. The concept of Nordic exceptionalism describes a series of narratives that create the notion of the Nordic countries as a homogeneous geographical entity built on shared values such as tolerance, equality, and liberalism, at times dimming the differences of the Scandinavian countries in favor of the joint. Swedish political scientist Maj Palmberg has referred to the frequent assumption that the Scandinavian countries do not have a colonial past and therefore are freed from a burdening colonial heritage. This assumption has played a significant role in the shaping of the Scandinavians' image as the good Westerners. If Palmberg's thesis holds true, it may support the theory of Nordic exceptionalism as a categorical construction. Looking at the historical events that have contributed to the notion of an exceptional pan-Nordic space, colonial history is one of those where there are only few similarities between the Nordic countries. Compared to its neighbors, Denmark has had a larger number of colonies. Sweden never managed to become a major overseas colonial power. And, Norway, Iceland, and Finland were in the heyday of colonialism non-sovereign territories themselves, respectively in the Danish, the Swedish, and the Russian Empire. Denmark, however, had colonies not only in Greenland and the North Atlantic, but also in Africa, India, and the Caribbean. All the more, it is noteworthy that Danish literature and historiography seem to feature a continuous narrative that marks Denmark's colonial behavior as exceptional, an impartial analogy to the notion of the Scandinavians' absence in Western colonial imperialism. There is a seemingly still existing narrative that displays Denmark not only as an unusual and different colonial power, but even as a more benevolent one. In my current research project, I tried to show how, under what historical circumstances, and on what discursive grounds, the narrative of Denmark as a humane and ethically and morally superior colonial power has come into being. I examine how the narrative has been reproduced, modified, and possibly corrected in historiographical and literary discourses from the late 1800s until today. At the same time, when allegedly unique Danish values are controversially discussed more than ever before, there also appears a number of new Danish Greenland novels on the market these days. Authors like Kim Leine, Lotte Enoch, and Kirsten Jensen write from the perspective of the contact zone and partly base their stories on autobiographical experiences. In these texts, we can find a performative breach, I will argue, with the textual reproduction of the narrative about the allegedly humane colonialism. It is therefore worthy to analyze to what extent this new Danish Greenland literature contributes to a possible revision of the Danish national identity. Greenland is also the place where the narrative about humane colonialism appears to have its roots. Texts from the second half of the 19th century are often written by authors affiliated to a colonial administration in Greenland. It is here the concept of protection policies is developed, as a euphemistic term for Denmark's behavior as a colonial power. The text can be read in the light of a paradigm shift in representation praxis that led to that from then on the colonized Greenlandic population was regarded as noble savages. The simultaneous creation of a Danish national identity in the latter half of the 19th century, contributed to the nation being strengthened internally after the loss of the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein in 1864. Denmark was now perceived as exceptional and as a society based on specific democratic values, which seems to have influenced the exposition of Danish colonialism and helped to highlight it as different and particularly humane. It is, however, by no means solely a Danish discourse to attribute the colonial endeavor a humanitarian meaning. Just think of Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, The White Man's Burden. However, what seems to be unique in the Danish depiction of the country's colonial past is that the colonial power is not only represented as culturally and morally superior in relation to the colonized peoples, but also in comparison to other European colonial powers. The Danish nobleman Kai Schaffelitsky de Muckadel, here we have him, he writes in his book, Greenland in Times of Change in 1929, quote, "There hardly is any doubt that colonial politics is one of the darkest chapters in the people's history," end quote. Just to continue over several pages, that the Danish colonization of Greenland should be seen as an exception to this. And Danish geographer and travel writer Sophie Petersen writes in her book Grønland i hverdag og fest in 1928 the following: Danish colonization and exploration of Greenland is without parallel in the nation's colonization history. It has provoked admiration and meant very much to our reputation in the cultural world. And time after time, it has been stressed that Denmark is the only country that has known how to protect nature people against extinction. End quote. It should be noted that Denmark, in the time when these books were written, stood in open conflict with Norway about territories on Greenland's eastern coast. This is a correlation that may have promoted positive portrayals of the country's colonial rule in Greenland. Yet, it must also be noted that the narrative about a humane kind of colonialism has established itself in the discourse on Denmark's historic cultural encounters. I could cite many more examples, even of a more recent date, and what is most interesting, even descriptions in novels that deal with Denmark's historical presence in the Caribbean, today's US Virgin Islands, which Denmark sold to the United States in 1917. My hypothesis is that the narratives that were formed in connection with Denmark's presence in Greenland are being transferred to these texts as well. This means that concrete memories of the far less humane colonialism in the Caribbean, which was based on slave economy, is falling into a kind of collective oblivion. In this way, Greenland seems to have played a significant role in the construction of an image of Denmark as a colonial power, which in its entirety is characterized by an exceptional humanism. The numerous popular novels published in the years after the transfer of the islands can also be read in the light of the culmination of a long national story of loss, which may have resulted in a need for the individual as well as for the nation to performatively stage themselves as humane and superior. We are familiar with these nexus since Karen Blixen's novel Out of Africa. The attention paid to the former Danish Governor-General Peter von Scholten's humanism that allegedly led to the emancipation of slaves in 1848 allows the reproduction of the narrative at a time when the literary discourse otherwise focused around colonialism's cruelty. Over the last few years, we have been witnessing an increased interest in Danish and Scandinavian historical and contemporary interventions outside of the region. This interest is reflected by a new interpretation of the old and new cultural encounters in literature, film, and art. I'm thinking, for example, of Jacob Ejersbo's so-called Africa trilogy that deconstructs the alleged Scandinavian altruism in aid work in East Africa. But I also think of Kim Leine's successful Greenland novels and the oppositional landscapes in Susanne Bier's feature films. One could mention plenty of recent works by Scandinavian writers and artists that have cultural encounters as their subject and are worth looking at with post-colonial glasses. the before-mentioned recent Danish works, which I call Greenland literature, fall into this category, as they theme to interrupt the reproduction of the narrative about the humane colonialism. In my ongoing research, I will discuss in how far these texts can be read in the light of the question whether Denmark's image as a Nordic exceptional country is changing after a decade marked by conflicts around the new cultural encounters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it seems to me now that we only have one more panelist before in this panel. And that is Angelos Parigoris. He is a department member of the University of Iceland in archaeology and explores some of the key aspects of the intricate relationship of Icelandic archaeology with nationalism. And he has also focused a lot on crypto-colonialism in this aspect.
A little bit. Well, thank you very much for the invitation today. My presentation is based on a chapter that I co-authored with my supervisor, Dr. Gavin Lucas, with the homonymous title, Icelandic Archaeology and the Ambiguities of Colonialism, which was published recently on a book on Scandinavian colonialism. So without any further ado, I will start by stating that the official Icelandic historical narrative of independence has for many years been teaching us that Iceland has succeeded national emancipation in a problematic way. National independence was the inescapable outcome of two parties who did not wish to be part of a union. The so-called divorce was a long legalist, constitutionalist, and above all peaceful process. It lacked any violent conflicts that in many respects revealed that what we had to deal with was not a struggle between the colonized and the colonizers, or the oppressed and the oppressors, but between two understanding and civilized ex-partners. Not few are the suggestions in this case that the Icelandic way to independence has to be emulated in those parts of the world that are troubled by the ills of nationalism, and should therefore represent the ideal model of political behavior. Within this framework, Iceland has come to represent an alternative or third way to independence and state formation. This is largely due to the fact that Iceland has never neatly fallen into the most often polarized categories of nation and colony, colonized and colonizer. It is nowadays largely accepted that Iceland has no colonial past and therefore has never suffered from colonial oppression, exploitation, and repression. How could it ever fit into such categories? After all, Iceland has been perceived as a place to escape from the corruption of modernity, with its pristine nature and simpler way of life, and as static and primitive since the 19th century. By European standards, it carried both an exoticism and a familiarity. The familiarity was manifested in history, religion, and the Icelandic literary tradition, whereas Icelanders were considered as the custodians of the Danish national or even pan-Scandinavian heritage. At the same time, perceptions of Iceland and Icelanders by other Europeans during the 19th century were often not very favorable. Iceland was often portrayed as a backward, uncivilized place by the increasing number of tourists and scientific expeditions who went there from the mid-18th century. In many ways, Iceland presented an anomaly in the dualities inherent in the colonialist, imperialist, and nationalist rhetoric, which distinguished the civilized from the uncivilized. In other words, it occupied an in-between position on the borderland between the civilized and the uncivilized nations of the 19th century, a distinction which largely mirrored the position of a country within a political geography which separated the colonizers from the colonized. Within this framework, numerous are the works that have attempted to locate Iceland's position within the Danish realm. Most academics have tended to bind the colonial experience of Iceland to the very specific spheres of politics and economics, and have alternatively positioned Iceland either on the side of the colonizers or the colonized. Nevertheless, Iceland never fitted exactly into the colonial political geography. The 19th and 20th century politics of simultaneous exclusion and inclusion of Iceland within the League of the Civilized European Nations, the tensions between cultural greatness and savagery, modernity and primitiveness, have necessitated the creation of a new political geography which could give Iceland a firm place in history. Terms such as Scandinavian Orientalism, Pan-Scandinavianism, and Arcticality have been devised in order to create a political geography in which Iceland can get rid of its ambiguous status, release the anxiety of belonging in a wider community of nations, and finds its place in the world, whether it sides with the rest of Scandinavia, the North Atlantic, or the Arctic. Yet again, we have more recently become quite aware that the colonial and nationalist experiences are more complex and dynamic processes. They are ontologies that continuously construct themselves and their social agents. They define people's place in society and guide their social interaction, while their influence can only be measured partially when dealing with the political and economic contexts alone. They have developed in parallel trajectories, and their relationship involves such heterogeneous networks of power that it becomes impossible to contain them in one uniform and articulate narrative. Nationalism itself is a product that is stemming from the ambivalence inherent in colonial situations. It is a derivative discourse of colonialism within which anti-colonial sentiments create an illusory antithesis between nationalism and colonialism. Perhaps one of the serious transgressions in the creation of the Icelandic nationalist narrative is the failure to recognize the entanglement of colonialism and nationalism. For some, the failure to identify this intersection reveals the lasting effects of colonialism in Icelandic academia after the decolonization of the country, whether this is perceived as economic, political, or cultural. A starting point in historically identifying this entanglement comes from the fact that the Icelandic elites and intellectuals of the 19th and early 20th centuries tried to distance themselves from the image of barbaric coarseness and backwardness through participating in the same colonial discourse of non-Western people. Such a discourse was a deliberate attempt to counter foreign perceptions of Iceland, which might have aligned the island with non-European others and instead situate Iceland emphatically within the European core. It is within such a framework that the Icelandic and Danish antiquarians participated actively in the production of a colonial cum nationalist discourse, although it manifested itself in a rather unusual way. Part of this must relate to the historical role archaeology played, or rather did not play, in the independence movement in Iceland. Unlike many other countries, the role of archaeology was minimal in nationalist discourse. Far more important was the literary and linguistic heritage. But why was this? In part, it relates to the way in which the literary heritage attested to a degree of modernity or civilization that none of its monuments or ruins could ever do. Iceland's medieval literary heritage was a far more powerful tool in the fight for independence than archaeology, because it demonstrated Iceland's right to be counted as a modernizing and advanced nation. In contrast, its archaeological remains were often nondescript and certainly unimpressive when compared with the archaeology of Denmark or indeed other European countries. In fact, it was much easier and less contentious to subsume the archaeological record of Iceland within a broader pan-Scandinavian cultural tradition, which is how it was perceived in many ways by both Icelandic and Danish antiquarians. Nonetheless, archaeology was conscripted to the nationalist and colonialist cause, and was done so by aligning it to the more potent literary heritage which acted to turn such nondescript sites into monuments. Along these lines, the Icelandic member of the Danish Royal Commission for the Preservation of Antiquities, Finnur Magnusson, undertook a systematic survey of all the visible monuments in Iceland in 1816. His survey of remarkable antiquities in Iceland was comprised of reports sent by each Icelandic parish and constituted the basis upon which the first preservation order was put in 1817. Similarly, the Icelandic Literary Society attempted to complete a total description of Iceland in the mid-19th century. Part of this project was to locate ancient monuments. On both occasions, ancient ruins were associated to saga events and historic figures. Early antiquarians, such as Danish scholars Christian Kallund, Daniel Brun, the Icelandic Sigurður Vigfússon, and Brynjulfur Jonsson, all contributed in their own ways in recording ancient monuments, legends, and folklore, describing landscapes and making literary analogies to the medieval sagas. They were partners in creating the modern structures of professional archaeology, as seen in the establishment of the collection of Icelandic antiquities in 1863 and the Archaeological Society in 1879. The conviction that language, race, religion, and in our case ancient monuments, can measure the civility and cultural superiority of a nation is shared by both the nationalist and colonialist discourse. As fundamental ideologies of Western modernity, they create a civilizing discourse within which national entities and colonial empires are entangled in a race to top the hierarchy of the civilized, modernized world. Apart from this official participation of Icelandic antiquarians in this colonial cum nationalist discourse, how can the archaeological record itself assist us in recognizing this entanglement? Quite undoubtedly, Iceland did directly benefit from the colonial project through the acquisition of goods produced and traded in the overseas colonies, such as sugar, coffee, and tobacco, which entered Iceland in increasing amounts over the 18th century. Archaeologically, finds of clay tobacco pipes and new ceramic forms, as well as oriental porcelain, are the most obvious indication of such influences from the colonial enterprise and occur on archaeological sites in Iceland from the 17th century onwards, especially on settlements of the elite. The details of this process, however, remain obscure. That is quite how this influx of new goods and materials from the colonies affected existing lifeways is unknown, although archaeology remains one of the best means for examining such a process. One of these effects must have been the awareness of a very different cultural aesthetic, as exemplified, for example, through Chinese porcelain. The popularity of the Chinese style in European culture during the 18th and early 19th century speaks of a more general desire for otherness and novelty, the characteristic hallmarks of a modernist outlook. Yet, the significant element here is how China, as the alien or foreign other, becomes the means of expressing this modernity. We can explore this through an even more recent phenomenon. In 2006, archaeologists working at a site in the southwest of Iceland found a small but complete green glass bottle dating to the 1930s. Embossed lettering on the bottle indicated that this held a commercial product called pigmentan, manufactured in Germany, which was used to both tan and protect the skin from the sun. Skin tanning became in vogue in Europe during the late 1920s, but especially from the 1940s. Prior to that, tanned skin was often perceived as a lower or working class trait. Indeed, the darkness of skin tone in general was used as a material signifier of racial and cultural hierarchy, especially during the late 19th century. Kristín Loftsdóttir has written much about the ideology of whiteness in Icelandic identity formation, linking it to wider European discourses on race and specifically on how the emergence of nationalism in 19th century Iceland drew on such a colonial discourse to legitimate its claims. What is interesting about this bottle, however, is how, like the example of the Chinese porcelain, testified to the adoption or incorporation of the foreign other rather than its separation as a signifier of modernity. Even so, it works in much the same way as Loftsdóttir has suggested about the Icelandic discourse on Africa. It aligns Icelanders with the colonizers rather than with the colonized. At the same time, however, other materials within the archaeological record can speak of the resistance of Icelanders against the Danes, therefore aligning them with the colonized or oppressed rather than the colonizers. There's some fetish there with the bottles, but... Recent excavations at an early industrial fishing village, which was occupied between 1907 and 1943 in the Bay of Reykjavik, uncovered fragments of an embossed flask which held a blended whiskey from a New York distillery called Littlemore, which operated between 1907 and 1936. Given these dates, its presence on this site suggests a flouting of the prohibition which was in effect at the time, an activity that is known to have occurred from contemporary newspaper sources. One story in particular is worth telling because of the explicit associations with nationalism. In 1917, the fishing trawler Thor docked at Vidi and unloaded an illegal cargo of alcohol, which everyone in the village seemed to know about and take advantage of. Despite the villagers keeping quiet about it, the authorities heard of it and impounded what remained of the whiskey. One of the few villagers who were against the cargo, a school teacher, was later accused of tipping off the authorities. She promptly wrote a letter to the national newspaper Morgunblaðið denying this charge, but openly confessed her dislike of alcohol in flagrant nationalistic terms. I find alcohol to be a powerful enemy which makes war against my country, and what is more, consider it treason to join up with it or to tolerate its arrival unhindered, as it could do even more harm here than in other places. I believe it should be the duty of all good men and true Icelanders to fight against it, not the least my duty as a member of the temperance movement. This othering of alcohol, and in particular associating with the Danes, linked the temperance movement directly to the nationalist cause. At least for the early period, prohibition became a form of independence by other means, while those who indulged in alcohol consumption were underlining the subservience not only to the bottle, but to the Danish culture and the Danish state. Quite undoubtedly, the archaeological records clearly speaks of the ambiguity of the colonial status of Iceland, an ambiguity that has ultimately impacted on the nature of Icelandic nationalism. Insofar as Iceland struggled for independence from Denmark, its shared cultural heritage meant that any such separation was bound to be equivocal, if not politically, at least ideologically. Paraphrasing Herzfeld, one might suggest that for a country like Iceland, they need to establish a nation equal to those of others, and the creation of a stable national identity involved a sacrifice, not so much of economic dependence, as Herzfeld might argue, but of cultural dependence. Just as 19th and early 20th century archaeologists often portrayed Icelandic material remains in terms of a pan-Scandinavian heritage, so a common contemporary refrain in academic discourse is the situating of Iceland within a broader supra-entity of yet another imagined community to which Iceland belongs. If not Scandinavia, then the North Atlantic or the Arctic. Within this framework, terms such as Scandinavian Orientalism, Arcticality, Borealism, even though constructed to counteract the modern essentialist discourses that pervade Icelandic society through tourism, nationalism, and discourses of globalization, only succeed to connote the anxiety to be included within some larger cultural entity or a wider community of the North that accepts Iceland as an equal partner and contributor. While the generation of the above terms is an attempt to transcend the ambivalence of Iceland's former colonial status, or indeed the colonialist nationalist dichotomy, they do so at a cost. This cost is the increase rather than the decrease of the anxiety concerning the cultural identity of Icelanders, an anxiety of belonging and a place in the world. Iceland may not have been a colonizer, and it may not have been a colony, but it's precisely because it does not neatly fall into these categories that demands close attention. For like other so-called crypto-colonies, it raises questions over the distribution of cultural significance and who decides what counts as important. Thank you.